A guy finds a monster in his barn and decides to use it to his advantage. We see a man with a rifle running through the forest before dawn, fleeing from someone. He hides behind trees, terrified, ready to shoot, while the mysterious dark figure moves behind him. The man keeps running but soon trips and falls. The dark figure catches up to him. It's a creepy vampire with yellow eyes and sharp teeth. The vampire bites into the man's neck, but then sunlight breaks through and falls on the vampire. The vampire burns up, and the man's hand, accidentally exposed to the sunlight, also starts to burn, apparently due to the vampire's bite. The vampire is reduced to a pile of ashes, and the man starts running again, avoiding direct sunlight. He soon finds a piece of burlap, covers himself with it, and hides in the barn of a nearby house. Judging by the sounds, he completely transforms into a vampire inside the barn. Meanwhile, in the house where the barn is located, a guy named Stan comes downstairs for breakfast and catches his parents sharing a kiss. His father suggests they go to the cabin for the weekend and promises to teach him how to drive, to which Stan eagerly agrees. The family appears loving and happy, but suddenly everything changes. Stan's mother transforms into a sickly, exhausted woman, and his father shoots himself in the head. Luckily, it's just a nightmare, but in reality, there's no happy family either. Stan wakes up from the dream to the sound of his grumpy grandfather, Ellis, banging on the door, annoyed that Stan locked it. Finally, Stan lets him in, and Ellis accuses him of being irresponsible, reminding him that at his age, he was already fighting in the war. It seems Stan has heard this lecture many times before. When he starts repeating Ellis's familiar words aloud, his grandfather grabs him by the shoulder and pins him against the wall. Ellis reminds him that, thanks to him, Stan got out of juvenile detention and demands that he follow his rules. Stan decides against engaging Ellis in a futile argument, apologizes, and heads to school on his bike, but it's clear his problems extend beyond his family. On the way, some schoolmates decide to bully him and nearly run him off the road. Stan swerves to avoid the collision and ends up crashing into the sheriff's car. The deputy sheriff gets out, inspects the car for damage, but finds none. He tells Stan he's lucky and reminds him that after he turns 18 next month, any trouble he gets into will have more serious consequences. However, Sheriff Dorney is more lenient with Stan, suggesting he just needs some rest after his time in juvenile detention. Finally arriving at school, Stan sees the bullies who ran him off the road now tormenting his friend Dhama. Stan steps in to defend him and almost gets into a fight with their leader, Marble, but a teacher intervenes, urging them to get to class. Stan and Dhama decide to skip school for the day. While wandering around town, they talk about the bullies and a girl named Roxy. Dhama asks when Stan will finally ask her out. Stan insists they're just friends, but Dhama doesn't believe him, reminding him that their feud with Marble and his gang started because Roxy began hanging out with them. Dhama makes derogatory comments about Roxy, but Stan defends her and tells him to stop. Later, Stan returns home and goes up to the attic, where he listens to music and looks at childhood photos of him with his parents. He then looks at a large scar on his hand and takes out a knife, seemingly about to harm himself again. However, he changes his mind and angrily stabs the knife into the floor instead. Soon, his grandfather starts yelling again, demanding that Stan mow the lawn. Stan has no choice but to comply. He goes outside with his dog and heads to the barn. As they get closer, the dog starts barking anxiously, and Stan goes inside to make sure no one is there. In the barn, Stan finds several human teeth. As he examines the eerie discovery, the man who turned into a vampire appears behind him. Stan hears a growl and, terrified, he bolts out of the barn, mistaking the vampire for a drug addict. Stan threatens the vampire that he'll unleash his dog on him if he doesn't leave. No one emerges from the barn, so Stan releases the dog. The animal runs inside barking but soon goes silent. Stan calls for his dog, but there's no response. Then, the barn door swings open, and the dog's head flies out. In a state of shock, Stan races back to the house and heads to the kitchen to grab a knife, but Ellis appears. Stan explains that some lunatic killed their dog. Initially skeptical, Ellis eventually realizes the dog isn't responding and decides to check the barn himself. He finds the dog's head in the grass and gives the psycho a chance to come out peacefully, but no one emerges from the barn. The man decides to go inside to confront the madman. Inside, he finds only the dog's body and prepares to blame his grandson again, but then the vampire attacks him. Stan rushes to Ellis's aid. The seriously injured man briefly appears in the doorway, but the vampire drags him away for good. Terrified, Stan tightly chains the barn door shut and returns home to calm his nerves with a bottle of beer. The guy plans to call the cops but comes across a document on early release and decides not to involve the sheriff to avoid trouble. In the evening, he nails shut the windows and doors of the barn and goes to sleep. However, in the middle of the night, he wakes up to someone trying to open his bedroom door. Assuming it's his grandfather, Stan checks but finds no one outside. He searches all the rooms in the house but finds no one. However, the strange noises continue to bother him, and he decides to approach the barn, where light is emanating. But then it turns out it was just another scary dream. The next day, Roxy approaches Stan and says she understands he doesn't like her hanging out with Marble and his crew. However, she admits she'll associate with whoever benefits her until she finishes school and leaves town. Stan remarks that she'll probably continue to behave that way even though Roxy doesn't believe it. Then they talk about their parents, and Roxy says everyone hates their parents. She stops herself, remembering Stan is grieving for his parents, but he admits he also hates them for not being around. Stan wants to tell Roxy about what happened to his grandfather, but Dhama interrupts them. The girl hastily leaves, and Stan accuses his friend of interrupting their conversation. Dhama leaves alone and is again pursued by Marble's gang. Stan flips them off, and the bullies get out of the car and start beating him up. Meanwhile, at home, Stan looks out the window at the barn and suddenly sees someone trying to open the door from the inside. He grabs a bat and approaches the barn, asking if anyone's inside. Getting no answer, he moves closer to the door. Stan wakes up and finds himself in a nightmare scenario where Dhama accuses him of abandoning him for Roxy, resulting in him getting beaten up by the thugs. Dhama notices the broken barn door and demands an explanation from Stan. Reluctantly, Stan tells Dhama that there's a dangerous creature in the barn that killed his dog and grandfather, and now wants to destroy him too. However, Dhama doesn't believe his friend and demands proof that someone is really in the barn. Stan agrees to show him and goes to get tools to patch up the hole in the door before sunset. Meanwhile, Dhama decides to approach closer to the barn to look inside, and that's when the vampire tries to break out again. Stan manages to close the opening just in time with a metal plate and boards it up from above. Instead of fear, Dhama feels excitement. He suggests that, thanks to the monster, no one will bully them anymore. They just need to invite their enemies home and trap them in the barn. Stan is horrified by Dhama's idea because the vampire poses a threat to everyone, not just Marble and his gang. However, Dhama insists on seizing the opportunity to get revenge on their tormentors who have been bullying him for years. Stan pleads with Dhama not to tell anyone about the monster to avoid getting into trouble with the police. Reluctantly, Dhama agrees to keep the secret, but it seems he may be plotting something of his own. That night, Stan settles in to watch a classic vampire movie that meticulously details various methods to vanquish the undead: sunlight, a wooden stake driven through the heart, and decapitation. He falls asleep and has another nightmare where Roxy appears in his bed, kisses him, and then turns into a vampire and bites him. Stan wakes up in a panic, grabs a knife, navigates through the darkened house but soon realizes there's no one in the room. Armed with a drill, Stan heads to the barn and drills numerous holes through which daylight streams inside, injuring the vampire. Then Stan comes home and Sheriff Dorney knocks on the door. She politely inquires about Stan's grandpa, wondering if he might be home. Stan, catching his breath, shakes his head gently, explaining that his grandpa is out running errands and won't be back until later. Dorney also tells Stan that Joe Bain, who lives nearby with his family, went into the woods recently and hasn't returned. She asks if Ellis had any conflict with Bain, but Stan assures her he doesn't know anything. Despite this, Dorney decides to enter the house to question him further. She shows him a photo of a man who turned into a vampire, but Stan insists he doesn't know him. Dorney asks him to call if he learns anything, then insists on giving him a ride to school. Stan doesn't like the idea, but he has no choice but to agree. As Stan goes upstairs to get his bag, Dorney looks around the house and notices his grandpa's cane abandoned in the middle of the room, suspecting he hasn't gone anywhere. When they arrive at the school, Dorney asks Stan if he wants to tell her anything, but he assures her everything is fine and gets out of the car. At school, he meets Roxy again. She's worried about the scratches on his face and asks what he wanted to tell her. Their conversation is interrupted by Marble, who deliberately says mean things to Roxy. This sets Stan off, and he attacks Marble, starting a fight. The teacher intervenes and says he would like to speak with Ellis about temporarily suspending Stan from school. He also informs them that Sheriff Dorney is on her way to Ellis's house to bring Stan to school. Upon hearing this, Stan rushes home to stop her, but Dorney arrives at his house first. She knocks on the door, but no one answers. Suddenly, she hears a strange noise from the shed and decides to check it out. From inside, cries for help can be heard, and Dorney, thinking Stan's grandpa is trapped inside, approaches and shoots the lock. At that moment, Stan finally catches up and begs her not to open the door. However, Dorney points her gun at him, believing he's hiding Ellis in the shed. Stan tries to convince her that it's not his grandpa inside, but Joe Bain himself. However, the sheriff refuses to listen and declares him under arrest. Dorney opens the door and asks Stan's grandpa to come out, but then a vampire attacks her. The monster bites into her neck and tears off her arm, dragging her body into the barn. Meanwhile, in the yard, Marble shows up wanting to get revenge on Stan for publicly humiliating him. Stan asks to be let go because he needs to fix the barn quickly, but Marble, however, remains unmoved by Stan's plea. Marble puts on brass knuckles to beat him up, but they're interrupted by the sound of a gunshot. It turns out Dhama is shooting nearby. He continues firing close to Marble, indicating he means business. Stan begs him to stop, but Dhama is intent on getting payback for years of torment. Dhama says he won't shoot if Marble goes into the barn. Marble keeps apologizing for everything he's done, but it doesn't help. He edges closer to the barn and notices a severed hand nearby. He realizes something dangerous is inside and reluctantly goes in to avoid getting shot in the head. A few seconds later, terrifying screams come from inside the barn. Stan hysterically accuses Dhama of killing Marble, and Dhama hits Stan on the head with his gun to calm him down. After a while, Stan regains consciousness and sees Roxy looking worried beside him. He checks around and sees the barn door open with no sign of Dhama. Stan asks Roxy to stay back safely, grabs a bat, and cautiously enters the barn. In the darkness, he sees Marble and asks Joe Bane to let him go. But instead of Bane, it's Dhama who's there, now transformed into a vampire. Dhama says Bane has left but will surely return. Dhama starts approaching Stan, claiming he's now stronger. Stan pleads with him to stop, reminding him they're best friends, but Dhama attacks anyway. Stan manages to injure him with the bat and exposes his arm to sunlight. Dhama collapses in pain, unconscious. Stan exits the barn, shocked by what has happened to his friend. Roxy rushes to Stan and asks what happened, but before he can answer, suddenly,
I'm sorry.
Meanwhile, the daylight finally finishes off Dhama, and Stan covers his charred body with a white sheet. Roxy again demands to know what happened, and Stan tells her the truth, asking for her help. Stan and Roxy carry Dhama's body into the barn, then fortify the windows with wooden boards and prepare weapons, getting ready to face Bane. Stan then asks Roxy to leave before sundown, but she insists on staying with him. Night falls, and Bane wakes up somewhere in the woods. At that moment, Marble's friends, Pitt and Ozzy, knock on the door, demanding to know where he is. Stan and Roxy assure them Marble isn't there and urge them to leave quickly, but the guys want to confront Stan. Ozzy notices Bane approaching and tells Pitt it's time to go. Pitt ignores him, and Ozzy decides to run for it. But just then, the vampire attacks him from above. Pitt, terrified, begs to be let into the house, and Stan opens the door for him. Pitt keeps screaming in shock, but Roxy tells him Marble is dead and warns him that if he doesn't quiet down, he'll meet the same fate as his friends. Meanwhile, the vampire cuts off the electricity in the house. Stan and Roxy are confident they have nothing to fear inside because they've secured all the windows and doors. Stan asks Roxy if she's forgotten about the attic, but she admits she didn't even know it existed. At that moment, they hear loud noises upstairs. Together with Pitt, they head to the second floor to investigate. Stan informs the others about ways to destroy vampires, and they split up to carefully search each room. Pitt enters one room and sees that a window is open. He cautiously closes it, but behind him appears Ozzy, now turned into a vampire. Meanwhile, in other rooms, Stan grabs a shotgun from the wall, while Roxy gets distracted looking at old photos. Suddenly, Bane attacks Roxy and drags her up to the attic. Stan rushes into the hallway and encounters Marble's friends, now turned into vampires. Stan hides from them in a room, loads the shotgun, while the vampires break through the door. Fortunately, Stan manages to destroy 2 vampires with a single shot. After that, Stan heads up to the attic and stops Bane just as he's about to sink his teeth into Roxy's neck. He shoots Bane with a shotgun and then swings an axe at him, but Bane proves too strong. Bane grabs Stan by the neck, and Roxy picks up the shotgun, shooting Bane in the face, yet he survives again. Stan then grabs a knife and throws it at Bane's chest, but Bane dodges, and the knife hits Roxy in the shoulder. The vampire attacks Stan once more, but Roxy finds the strength to grab the axe and with one swing, she decapitates him. Having defeated all the vampires, Stan and Roxy gather their bodies in the barn, set it on fire, and watch it burn. In the morning, they wake up in Marble's car, and Stan asks if Roxy closed the trunk, but she thought Stan had done it. Meanwhile, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the trunk lid creaks open behind them, revealing a sliver of darkness within, a haunting reminder that their battle against the vampires may not be over yet. How would you handle discovering a vampire in your barn? Would you consider using its abilities to your advantage? Share your thoughts in the comments below, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.